Hello and welcome to another Rocket Jump Events online video. My name is Adam Burt and today I'm joined by Simon Carless, creator of the Game Discoverability Now newsletter and founder of Game Discover Co. How are you, Simon?
I'm doing great, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. Now, usually Rocket Jump events are a chance for people to gather in person, to mingle, to watch talks and interviews with industry figures. And obviously, we can't safely do that this year due to the pandemic and lockdown, so instead, we've got this online format, and I want to thank Simon for taking the time to join us today. Simon, how's 2020 going for you?
It's been interesting, but on the plus side, I have managed to get out and do a lot more in the discoverability space, which is what you're talking to me about. So let's just pretend everything else didn't happen, and everything's great in the world of game discoverability. So that's good.
Cool. So, for those of you who maybe don't know at home, or those who are watching who don't know at home, how would you describe discoverability?
So I mean, I've been using this phrase game discoverability for a while now, and we actually did when I was running GDC. We did a game discoverability summit at GDC, and really, discoverability is how people find your video game, which it seems like a basic concept, but actually telescopes out to include all kinds of things. Because obviously, if you go back in time, how people found your video game was fairly easy. You did a game, it got put on cartridge or on disc or on tape, and it got sent to stores, and then people had the choice of a fairly small amount of games. And so, actually, but certainly if you were in major stores back then, you were sort of guaranteed to sell a certain amount of copies. So that was great. But obviously nowadays, we've got Steam and we've got iOS and Android, and we've got thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of games. So, it's definitely my view that how people find your game and decide to buy it is as important as whether your game is good or not. And so, for me, game discoverability includes things like, is your game set up to be discovered? Has it got an interesting premise? Has it got striking art or art style? That's sort of the very start. And then after you announce your game, how do you announce it? How many months out from shipping it do you announce it? Then how do you nurture your community? And then as you launch, like, what platforms are you launching on, and what are you doing after release or during release? How are you attracting streamers? So it's sort of a hybrid of planning, business, and marketing. But I think historically people have sort of been oh, well, we'll make the game and then we'll hire a PR agency, and the PR agency will make it popular. And I think that is not super workable and not really the right way to think about it. So that's one of the reasons I've been going quite hard on game discoverability as an idea, because I think it makes people think more holistically about how people find their
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's never been easier to make games, but it also means there's more competition than ever before. And this kind of stuff, the stuff that you talk about in your newsletter, is so important. It's the difference between having a good game and having a successful game, which is not something that comes naturally to everyone. If you could make every game developer or publisher, I guess, change one practice about their approach to game discoverability, what would it be?
Well, I think something that I'm big on is showing your game early and often, and I think that's something that you don't have to. I'm not saying that's the only way to be successful, but I think many people, especially when they're making their game, it's very precious to them. So they're pretty much like, I'm making this, I don't want to talk about it, or I'm too busy making it to talk about it. But then by the time you finish making it and then you release it, if you haven't talked to anyone about it, then it's not probably not going to sell. So I think the concept of whether it be early access, which is obviously one way to monetize early, or just being very good at developing a community on Discord and really telling people about the game regularly, and even actually giving streamers early copies of your game. I actually think that is uh, much less scary than people think, and potentially a good idea. And so I think it may show you that not many people are interested in your game, but you should probably know that earlier rather than later. So I think, and honestly, the more you do it, the more people will be interested. So I think the concept of kind of thinking about discoverability and thinking about broadcasting your game out to people is an important one. And I definitely see a lot of people who are kind of like, well, this game's going to come out in 3 months. What are we going to do to make sure it's successful? And I think, that does work sometimes, especially if you have a very streamer-friendly game. I've seen games that don't have that many wish lists close to launch, but then some really big streamers pick them up, and that's great. But streamer-friendly games are quite difficult to make and aren't necessarily for everybody. So I don't think you can rely on that. I think you do need to be, well planned and really think carefully about how and when you're showing your game to people.
Yeah, and we mentioned your newsletter, which has loads of great tips about discoverability and how to approach it. And clearly, a lot of research goes into those newsletters. When you're diving into a topic, where do you begin? How do you kind of do your research?
Well, I've been in an interesting situation where obviously my day job until recently was working on events and on GarmaSutra.com. I've been involved in the indie publisher No More Robots for about 3 years now, and I helped Mike Rose set it up, and he used to be an editor at GarmaSutra actually. So along the way, I've sort of had the opportunity to see, a bunch of this back end stuff. Obviously, see that the back end of Steam and consoles, and it makes me understand stuff better. So often I'll start with kind of something maybe I've seen in my role advising No More Robots, and then sort of expand it from there. Like a good example is there was a newsletter I just put out today, which is talking about how sometimes if you have a poor launch, it isn't the end of the world, because there was a game called Wonder Song that just came out that has actually done decently on its tail, although it didn't really do that well at all in its first few weeks on sale. So so you start looking at stuff like what is the revenue ratio of the first week to the first year for games that release on Steam, and that's important, because quite a lot of your financial planning, or if you have financially planned, will be based around like what is it hoping to make in its first year, and that can change radically. So I think a lot of the time I'm looking at a problem that I'm already thinking about, or I see with people I speak to in the industry, or on Discords I'm on, and then I try and blow it out a little bit. Obviously, some of this stuff is NDA'd, especially on console, or people don't always like talking about it. But something I've really been trying to do is find there are independent operators out there who are perfectly fine with talking about it, because maybe they don't have shareholders, or maybe it's going well enough for them that they're fine with talking about it. So I try and get additional information from there. So very specific information on stats or on tactics, and so I mean that's how I put it together. And I think I am in a bit of a unique situation where I can see the back end of a reasonably successful publisher, but also I'm able to write newsletters fairly unrestricted, because a number of us is pretty laissez-faire about that. So it does enable me to get a little bit deeper into it.
And you kind of hinted at it there about games that maybe do poorly at launch and then better in the tail. But I think a lot of people may be wondering, they can see how crucial it is to get discoverability before launch in the early stages of a game's life cycle. But what do you do if your game's already been out for a while? Are there things you can still do to, boost the discoverability after the fact?
Yeah, that's a good question. I definitely have had that question before, and I think the basic answer is there's a very few cases where things kind of blow up crazily after launch. Like Slay the Spire was one that did very well after launch, and Among Us obviously is the one that everyone's talking about right now. But in general, I think your trajectory is your trajectory, but you can tweak things which will help you. And in particular, I was actually working with a game that had already launched recently, and sort of helping them with this. You can do stuff around yield. So a good example is, maybe you've launched your game, or you're about to launch your game, and it's in early access, and it's $14.99. What should the launch price be? Shouldn't be $14.99. I don't think you've put a lot more time and effort into it. So you can talk about increasing the price. As long as it's fair for the amount of things you're offering. You can also talk about DLC, and actually a combination of DLC and discounting, at least on PC, is a really good way to increase your yield even further. So my view on post-launch is, that you're going to sell a small amount of copies every day, and you're going to sell a large amount of copies in sales, because that's what everybody does. But then, how are you maximizing the amount of copies that you're selling in the big Steam sales or in Switch sales, and at least on Steam, that's a lot to do with the fact of, for example, do you have DLC? Do you have an attractive package including DLC, which might make people spend more money? And I think something we've seen is that sometimes 30% of people in a big Steam sale will go for the deluxe package as opposed to the base package, and so then that just means you need to build some nice, interesting DLC for your game. But suddenly, let's say you put the price up by 30%, and you have a DLC that's like almost twice as expensive, and 30% of people buy that in sales. Suddenly you've increased your yield by 50+%. So it's like selling 50% more copies of the game. That's so much easier than actually selling 50% more copies of the game. So I think, yeah, so some of that yield stuff, and I didn't really fully understand the DLC stuff until recently. Some people explained it to me, and I was like, oh yeah, that does make sense. I think some of that is just smart tactics, and it's really admitting that like there's a certain amount of people who are interested in your game. Some of them have already wishlisted it. Some of them will find it in sales. But there isn't really, generally, unless a streamer picks you up randomly like 6 months after launch, there isn't really a way to get a ton more people to see the game, because there's thousands or tens of thousands of games out there. So I think you should be optimizing for yield.
Okay. And you've just announced your new business. We mentioned at the top of the show, Game Discover Co. What led to you starting it, and what are your kind of ambitions for where you're going to go with that this year and beyond?
So Game Discover Co is really a agency slash research consulting type thing, and it's really based around the fact that I'm very passionate about this space and I want to go deeper. I think a lot of it, honestly, is going to be based around me extending the newsletter. I'm going to be adding a optional paid element to it, and some of this is, there's a lot of data. I'm not really a coder, but there's a lot of data that I would love everyone to have further access to. So I'm working with a guy called Lars Doucette, who was actually a Steam contractor for a while and worked on some of the interesting features in Steam, like the similar tag editor in the back end and things like that. So he's a very data orientated person. He has a website called Game Data Crunch in the space, and so we're going to be working on some dashboards and some information that's going to be, I think, interesting to people in terms of, like, let's say there's a bunch of games coming out in 3 months' time, or a month's time, or a week's time. Can we work out which of them are actually going to be successful based on things like Steam followers and and online traffic and things like that? So I think this type of thing is useful, because you can start to see what genres are about to be successful, or maybe you're launching a game and you want to know if there's anything big coming out at the same time. So some of that stuff, so some of the results will still be available to everybody, but some of that stuff will be in this kind of fairly inexpensive subscription that I'm planning. And then also I'm just working with companies who are just interested in having this kind of analytical approach. Maybe they've had more of A&R driven approach, where they just see a game, they like it, and they sign it. But I think you can do a bit more analysis in that, into which genres or tags are popular, and you can get third party opinions. And so, yeah, so that's basically what I'm working on. And I think the good news about this is, as I keep boosting this up, I should have plenty of time to work on my regular newsletter, which is pretty comprehensive and goes out 2 or 3 times a week. So for anyone worried that this is just all stuff that they'll never get to see, I think some of this is kind of feedback into the free stuff I'm sending out as well.
Yeah, you've got like a 3-tiered solution there. You got the free stuff, premium stuff, and then the consulting. It's a good way to go about it. If people want to hear more from you, I mean, I guess if someone wants to sign up to the newsletter, where can they find you online? Where can they find out more about game discoverability?
Well, yeah, I definitely think GameDiscover.co is just my kind of stub website, which also has a link to the newsletter, which is hosted on Substack. So so I definitely think that that Substack and the newsletter, and there's quite a lot of older kind of newsletters in there as well that have relevant information. And I'm going to try at some point, I think, to compile the most relevant ones on a website for people to find, because some of the stuff is more timely, but some of it is fairly evergreen. And so I've done research, for example, on the Steam ratio of sales to reviews, which is kind of important when you look at a game. You want to know roughly how many copies it sold. So I think we ended up finding out, for a game launched in 2020, you should be multiplying the number of reviews by anywhere between 20 and 60, very roughly, to see how many copies it sold. So things like that are fairly evergreen. So I'm going to try and make sure people have access to those in a more obvious place. But for now, it's definitely newsletter centric. But yeah.
And are you on Twitter? You want followers there or anything?
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. Twitter Game Discover Co. Is the new Twitter for Game Discover Co. And then just Simon Carless, first name last name is my regular Twitter, and I do tweets. I tweet about other weird stuff, but I do also tweet about game discoverability. So yeah, I think you should definitely check that out. But actually, I will say, Twitter can be quite overwhelming, and one of the things I think people appreciate about the newsletter is that I tend to find all the good game discoverability stuff on Twitter and then email it to them so that they don't have to read Twitter constantly.
Yeah, it saves you from having to doom scroll on Twitter.
Exactly. So it's a little bit of it's a little bit of a shortcut, and then I get additional information from outside of that as well.
It sounds good. Thanks for joining me, Simon. That's really interesting. And yeah, people should definitely check out the newsletter. Check out Game Discover Co. It's a really fascinating proposition. Yeah, thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it.
And to you at home, thanks for tuning in and watching. This has been a Rocket Jump Events video presented by Etch Play. Archives of all of our videos and interviews, along with lots of other very interesting videos, are available on the Etch Play YouTube channel. So don't forget to like and subscribe to that. And we will see you next time. Bye.